what are those transitions that you had to go through to accept yourself that you are white?
Yeah.
And that's the brutality that we had to offer to blacks.
I think where it began was after our 3 kids were born. I was officially like the head of an interracial household. I was the father to kids who would identify as black.
You have started to look at America through the eyes of a black.
It is as if race is the only prism through which certain progressives would see us, that we are all the same part of humanity, right? Very quick history lessons, your audience in India that may not be all that familiar with the American Civil Rights Movement. Birmingham was far and away the worst, most racist, most violent place in America. There was this photo, and it was of 1963 in Birmingham, this 15-year-old boy named Walter Gadsden. His entire right side here is exposed, and the dog is just eating it. And in that photo, I saw basically the whole history of America. I saw the brutality that had been visited upon blacks, how Martin Luther King Jr., how Fred Shuttlesworth, how James Bevel, how are you guys so brave? The world spreads on power. Power decides everything. Gandhi was a huge influence on his life. And what Gandhi did was breathtaking. Gandhi's nonviolence is more dangerous than terrorism.
Paul, thank you so much. Such a pleasure having you here on my show, the xMonks Drive.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Pleasure is all mine. And, there are guests that you call when you know that you'll be able to have a meaningful exchange with them, that you would have something to add to. But while I was preparing for this conversation, I knew it, that there's very little that I'll be able to add. Because while going through the book, I could immerse myself in the stories that you have written.
Yeah, thank you.
And with every page that I was turning, I could see a shift in my heartbeat. It was so engrossing, yeah. Would love to hear, there are certain moments in our life that define the trajectory of our life. What was that moment or experience in your life that sparked your passion for social justice and equality?
I think it was in some measure dating my wife, who's black, but really I think where it began was after our 3 kids were born. We have today a 13-year-old daughter and twin 12-year-old boys. And especially after the boys were born, I realized that I was officially like the head of an interracial household and the head of, I was the father to kids who would identify as black in their lives, because here in the States, it's like, there's an old adage about the 1-drop rule, right? Like if you are 1 drop black, America's going to see you as black. And my wife, Sonia, was very much saying that, like, look, even though our kids are interracial, America is going to see them as black. So that being said, what I began to do was really try to understand what America is going to be like through their eyes and not my own. And that led me to just read a great amount of books, basically like the whole of the American Black canon. I had read certain people before, but really after the boys' birth, I just tried to immerse myself in that. And to answer your question, it was through that immersion that I began to see America through eyes that were not my own. And as I began to see America through eyes that were not my own, I began to relate to experiences that were, of course, I would have never thought to relate to simply because of the makeup of who I am, but because I'm now in this family and very much want to try to be a good dad to my kids. I'm thinking about how I can do that. I talk about this in the book, but there was this photo, and it was of 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama. And it showed this German Shepherd pretty much feasting upon this 15-year-old boy named Walter Gadsden. His entire right side here is exposed, and the dog is just eating it. This is what's known as the Project Confrontation, which is basically what the whole of the book is about. It's about like, when did America at last finally change? And it was the spring of 1963. And in that photo, I saw basically the whole history of America. I saw the brutality that had been visited upon blacks. I saw the dignity with which blacks responded. I saw how if this photo were taken in, say, 1913, nothing about it would be different. It would be just as brutal. But to see it through the lens of like 2013, 15 years later, just a couple years after my twin boys were born, it showed real progress. Because of photos like that, my wife, Sonia, and I were able ultimately to get married in a former Jim Crow state like Texas in the American South. And this is actually the Texas Longhorns here, my wife's alma mater. And to raise our kids on a quiet street where nobody harasses us for who we are. Yeah. That photo showed everything.
Yeah. In fact, in your book, you have mentioned that 15-year-old black man is standing so peacefully in front of that German shepherd, as if in the years to come, in the future generation is going to look at him as a courageous, non-violent individual.
Yeah.
You know, you mentioned that you have started to look at America through the eyes of a black. Tell me, what are those primary 3 things that you saw which are drastically different, that a white cannot even imagine and a black cannot even experience in his lifetime?
So there are a few things today with respect to, well, there's sort of like what's happening currently and also what was happening then. America today for my kids will always be a different experience than what I will experience. For instance, not too long ago, about a year ago, my wife, Sonia, one of the most loving, one of the kindest people I've ever known, was pulled over by cops. She was speeding or something. I forget exactly what it was, but the kids were in the car with her when that was happening. And the rigidity with which she sort of answered the question, the rigidity, like she even held her hands on the steering wheel at all times. And everything was yes, sir, no, sir, thank you, sir, right? And it wasn't a huge deal. But what I would say is that the kids noticed that it was different from how Sonia otherwise acted. The things that she said afterwards when the kids were like, wait, why did you act that way with that cop? Like, so official and just so weird, and like, you know, everything was stilted language and very formal. And she's like, you guys are going to have to act that way around cops every single time you encounter them, because that's the reality of what it means to be black in America. You must always be deferential to cops. Whereas for me, when I've been pulled over by cops, like sometimes for speeding or whatever, like sometimes I've actually been angry. I'm like, you didn't get me on anything. Like, you know, so like, that's one of the differences just there. But to answer your question, America today, and arguably the world today, is a drastically different place in large measure because of the civil disobedience campaign, nonviolent disobedient campaigns that began before the time of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and is in some senses extended after it. But what happened during that period, I mean, to go down to Birmingham, Alabama in the spring of 1963 meant to encounter a place where the Ku Klux Klan castrated black men as a means to intimidate Martin Luther King Jr. and his civil rights activists from coming to stage protest. Precisely. Birmingham police officers raped black women in their patrol cars. So in the States, there's this famous journalist of the 1960s. His name is Edward R. Murrow. And he reported from the Blitz in London in the 1940s, reported live for CBS as he was doing so. And by the 1960s, he was still working for CBS, one of the nation's, biggest broadcasters. But now he was working primarily on television. And just before King and the rest of the SCLC go down there to Birmingham, he turns to his producer and he says, I have not seen any place like this since Nazi Germany. That was the sort of place it was. That's how high the stakes were at that time.
Yeah. Paul, I'm just wondering, every time when you would go through these kind of instances and when you started doing a lot of research, what are those transitions that you had to go through to accept yourself that you are white?
Yeah.
And that's the brutality that we had to offer to so-called blacks.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that we all belong to the same humanity.
Well, the answer to your question lies in the question, that last bit there, despite the fact that we are all the same part of humanity, right? Like,
Yeah.
I have to give a lot of credit here to the way I was raised. I was raised in a very rural environment in the middle of America that was ostensibly very conservative.
Hmm.
But when, I began to date Sonia, no one within my family thought it strange that I was dating, like, I'm a rural farm boy, right? Sonia is an inner city girl. Like, she's raised in inner city Houston. And what both of us realized was there was a common humanity beneath us. So, when I'm doing this research, or really just as I've tried to lead my life, I am, of course, disgusted by any far right activist or far right conservative who's going to say, who's going to look at racial distinctions to say that these are the markers of us. But what I would also say is I have also been frustrated in the last 10 years, and really the last 5, with a progressive movement that has become ever more obsessed with skin deep differences as a way to say we must identify only through that because of the history of the things that have happened to us. That's the markers by which we must continue to be recognized, right? It is as if race is the only prism through which certain progressives would see us. And I think that is just as much wrong, right? Like, you and I are having this conversation right now. I'm loving this conversation. It has nothing to do with the fact that you're Indian and I'm white. It has everything to do with the fact that we are two people who share common interests, who are sort of like seeking out some sort of deeper truth, right? That's a big part of what your podcast explores. So, like, it doesn't matter to me what race you are, what nation you're from. The underlying humanity should always be the basis by which we understand and know and judge each other.
So true. Interestingly, Paul, you came up with this book, and I just loved the title of your book. That I find it quite intriguing. You said you have to be prepared to die before you can begin to live.
Yeah.
How did you come up with this title?
So it comes from a pastor in Birmingham, Fred Shuttlesworth.
Yeah.
So a very quick history lesson.
One of his best quotes.
Yeah, one of his best quotes. Very quick history lesson, especially for those in your audience in India that may not be all that familiar with the American Civil Rights Movement. So Fred Shuttlesworth, before Martin Luther King Jr. and the rest came from Atlanta to Birmingham, Fred was a pastor in Birmingham, and he was really at the vanguard of any sort of political and civil movements. And he was
1950s.
Since the 1950s. And by the way, like, the things I was talking about a minute ago about, like, how even by the standards of the racist and violent Jim Crow, Birmingham was far and away the worst, most racist, most violent place in America, arguably the most violent place in the world.
I'm not surprised. At one point in time, it was known as Birmingham.
Birmingham, yes.
Yeah.
And that was because of all the Black-owned businesses that had been dynamited and whose crimes were, quote, never solved, right? Yeah. So Fred is a civil rights activist, sometimes acting alone, literally alone in the city. And so just before Project Confrontation, which is the name of this actual campaign in 1963, just before it, he goes to New York City and to Harry Belafonte's apartment, who's this, like, acclaimed singer and actor, and they're trying to raise money. And some of the people there, some of the New Yorkers there, are just amazed by the stories Fred is telling, like the times he stepped in front of buses that failed to integrate, like the times he was beaten by the Klan for trying to integrate, for trying to bring his own daughters to an all-white high school. And and somebody just asks, like, how, Fred, have you been doing this? And he says, you have to be prepared to die before you can begin to live. And I think, if I may, I think he meant that literally. I think he meant that yeah, he had to sort of be, like, okay with this, before he could begin to act for civil rights. But I also think this is the part that still gives me goosebumps. Because he was a pastor, and because he understood stories and allegory, because he understood myths, not just within a Christian tradition, but within various religious traditions, he also understood the metaphor of death and rebirth. it's the resurrection story. And it need not be limited to, say, Jesus's life and what Christians think is the Christ, right? Ascending. We all, every single day, go through some sort of resurrection. We all, in other words, have to basically overcome who we have been to move toward the sort of person we long to be. You really do have to be prepared to die before you can begin to live. And I think Fred, and I know that Fred meant that as well when he said,
by all means, every moment there's a part of me is dying, because unless that die, I would not be able to become the person that I want to become.
Yeah.
Help me understand, Paul, while going through this journey, on one hand, you were doing a lot of research. At the same time, you must be watching your children going through some or the other kind of transition.
Yeah. Yeah.
What parts of you got killed in that journey?
Oh, what a great question. What a great question. There's two ways I can answer that, and they're separate. One's related to my family, the other's very much related to myself. So I mentioned a moment ago that my wife, Sonia, is from inner city Houston.
Yeah.
In the United States, this reached basically worldwide, but there was the gentleman named George Floyd. He was killed in 2020 by a police officer in Minneapolis.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That gave birth to this movement called Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter, yeah. Here's the thing about George. George grew up in Houston as well. George grew up, in fact, one neighborhood over from Sonia. Sonia spent a lot of her time in 5th Ward in inner city Houston. George grew up in the sort of equally hard up 3rd Ward. Sonia and George were the same age, 46. Sonia's cousins and a lot of her friends went to Yates High, where George Floyd went to school. Sonia's cousin Derek knew George back at Yates High. In fact, watched him as a tight end on the state championship football team that George played on. So I say all that because George's story and George's death was the first time that my wife and I did not shield our 3 kids from that coverage, in large part because George's death felt almost personal to my wife, Sonia, and my mother-in-law, Connie, who was by then living with us, who's also from inner city Houston. So as a result of that, our 3 kids really had to, like, that was in some sense, that was a death. Like the boys lost their innocence because they had a lot of questions about what exactly is happening. Why am I watching this? Like, wait, are you telling me that all cops are racist? If not that, are all cops bad? Like, and then everything we told them was like, at one point, one of our boys was like, well, I guess we'll be okay if we'll be safe, right? And Sonia and I hesitated because, George had been, nothing protected George, right? Like, he was begging Officer Chauvin to just listen to him, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm my hands are behind my back. Same thing with Breonna Taylor. She was a woman from Louisville, Kentucky. Cops barged in to her through her locked door, shot her 8 times for a crime she did not commit, right? So for us to say, yes, you'll be fine if you'll be safe, it's like, it's not necessarily true. So our boys, what died that day because of George Floyd was their innocence. And so they became really despondent. And in large measure, I wrote this book as a means to inspire them. I dedicated this book to the kids as almost a guide for how you can live, because the stories of perseverance and courage and ingenuity and kindness that run throughout this story, like, I want them to have that for the rest of their lives.
I can't even imagine the kind of impact it would have created for Blacks children in the US.
It's like our kids are really struggling with this as well. So that was absolutely something that was true and that was happening. Your question, though, about what had to die. So there's a part of me that had to do this too. So for a long time, for 17 years, I worked for a magazine and website that's known as and network that's known as ESPN. It's like the largest sports broadcaster in the US, arguably the world. And in November of 2020, during the pandemic, I was one of hundreds that were laid off. And man, that terrified me, because I'm like, what am I going to do now with my life? How am I going to feed my family of 6? How am I going to make this work? I had so much fear about what the future might hold, because I'd only known an existence that had ESPN in it in some capacity. So what happened was the deal for this book, the ability to like actually pursue this book, happened around the same time that I was laid off. And so I began to just like lean into this project. And I thought, well, I wanted to build a life for myself. I wanted to be my own boss. And that was terrifying in its own sense, right? What I realized was I had to understand how others persevered. I had to understand courage. And what was before me was one of the greatest acts of courage that I had ever seen. So day after day after day, when I'm doing this research, I'm asking it not just for the book, but I'm like, really like, no, really, how Martin Luther King Jr., how Fred Shuttlesworth, how James Bevel, who's another central character in the book, how are you guys so brave despite everything that you're facing? They all thought they were going to die down there, right? Like they literally thought they were going to be killed for going to Birmingham, which, by the way, they stood a better than even chance that they would have been.
Yeah.
But why do you persevere? How do you persevere? These were questions that suddenly weren't even pertinent to the research of the book. Like, I wanted to understand this. I wanted to take this in for myself. And so the thing that I realized I had to do was I had to distance myself from everything I'd known in the past and kind of begin to reform myself around the things that I'd always wanted to pursue. I had to like let go of any safety. I had to just forget about there is no safety net anymore, man. There's nothing beneath me, right? And because there's nothing beneath me, it's terrifying. But now at last, and just like Fred Shuttlesworth talked about, only when you are prepared to die do you realize what it feels like to actually begin to live. And it was exhilarating to begin to be out on my own. And it was thrilling.
Moment by moment, a part of you was dying.
Yes.
And that very moment you were giving birth to your own self.
Yes.
Take me through a moment when you found it extremely difficult to pull those scattered parts of your own self, because you were navigating through those kind of stories that would have actually triggered a lot of despair in your life.
Yeah.
And yet, one step at a time, you held yourself.
There were many instances. So there were times when Sonia and I would look at, say, our bank account and see the checking account going to ever more perilous numbers. And I'm like, should I just like get a job? Like, I don't, and we'd have a lot of discussions about it, right? Because it's, some of it is bound up with trying to be a good dad to my Black kids. But honestly, man, a lot of it is just like how to be a good provider, to a good father, period, regardless of who the kids are. And I nearly backed out. You know what kept me in it? It was this sense that like, if I leave and just take some job and stop with like the book that I'm writing, or there were like 5 or 6 other projects that I'd always wanted to pursue, but I never had. I won't bore you with my CV, but I'm like, if I leave and abandon that stuff, how am I going to feel 20 years from now, knowing that, okay, I took some other gig, right? But did that thing make me happy, even if it made me money? No. So like, that's how you stay in the moment. But that's just, I am prone to sort of what if catastrophizing. I don't know if you are too, where I'm like, well, wait, what if this happens? And then like, what if that happens? And suddenly you see the thoughts kind of blacken with each turn, because you're devolving into this catastrophe state, right? And there were so many, I mean, I woke up and there were so many days that I woke up in like a panic, like, how are we going to get through this? And you know what happens? I don't know if it's just perseverance or God or both, but we did. We got through. More projects came through. More success began to land and always, like just when it absolutely had to. It's like something's there to like, it's like a You're
Just in
going
time.
across, yeah, just in time. It's like you're going across some stream and you're like, I hope there's some pebble or rock or something here. I'm about to step down. And then there is. You're like, okay. And honestly, today, 3+ years later, again, I won't bore you with a CV, but like financially, we're in a better spot right now than we've ever been. And all I can attribute that to is honestly the book. And it's not even like the book's success, yes, but what it really is the lesson of the book. That's like, just persevere. And to persevere, you have to have the idea that to the book's title, you got to give up yourself. You got to die in some way to really move toward the life that you want to lead.
Yeah. You know why your title intrigued me so much? Because sometime back I was on a podcast, and this podcaster, the interviewer, asked me this question. And I said, one needs to prepare for death.
Yeah.
Rather than preparing for life. And the interviewer asked me, why do you say so, Gaurav? And I said, because, when you're preparing for life, you're holding on to things. You're getting stuck with an identity of who you believe you are, what you believe is good for you, what you believe that you have accomplished for yourself. What you don't realize is when you start to prepare for death, you let go of what is not necessary for you. And in that moment, you let go of the identity which is not even serving. Well, throughout that book, you have mentioned about Martin Luther King Jr.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me, what are those traits in him that helped you to continue to do more and more research and pick up those pearls and continue to strive for bringing a peace to the world that's going to inspire the world and stand for a cause for the years to come?
There's so much adversity. So we've already talked about the violence. We've talked about the sense that they thought they were going to die. King even delivered a mock eulogy just before they went down to Birmingham. He literally thought, like, we're going to die. Let's get the last rites out right now. Okay. But when they get down there, the thing that ended up inspiring me was their grand plan. It failed miserably. Like almost immediately, what they thought was going to work did not work at all. So as a result of that, they had to pivot. And it comes back to, I don't want to turn this whole conversation into a metaphor on this resurrection and birth and death and rebirth, but like it really was like they had to abandon every idea they had to make way for what might be possible. The best way to live is actually to acknowledge death every day. Because if you acknowledge death every day, what you end up realizing is the joy that is our lives, right? You gain an appreciation for it simply because you hold death close. And because you hold death close, I'm curious if this is the case for you, but like for me over these last few years, what has become crystal clear is what I want to do with my life professionally, as a husband, as a father, because I'm focusing now on how it can all be taken away, in a moment. I'm curious for you, like, how did you come to that? Because I think, I don't want to derail from the conversation, but I think it actually ties in with what King and those guys were talking about in the 1960s.
It's a beautiful question because, for the longest period of time, Paul, I've lived my life from a space of fear. That what if I don't have this? What if I don't have that? And for as long as I've known myself, I've lived from a space of scarcity.
Yeah.
It took me a lot of work on myself to experience what it means to have abundance in life, what it means to live from a space which is just now, today.
Yeah.
If you just notice yourself closely, every moment, actually, we are dying. You take a breath in, you take a pause. That moment, it's death. And then you release. And if I look at my life, one of the questions that I ask people is, who are you without your titles? And I've seen the best of the leaders. I've seen the most accomplished individuals. They start to fumble to respond to that question. Who are you without your titles? And people don't have an answer to that.
Yep. It's what Nietzsche talked about. And King talks about this too. Nietzsche said, if you have a why to live for, you can endure anyhow. King's why, King didn't need a title. Like he lived so sparsely. You know, he lived in a home that he rented with almost no accommodations because he never wanted to have the sense of like the material world affecting his own. He even fretted with his wife Coretta that they owned too many books, right? That's the sort of guy he was. So who was he without? He didn't need his title to be the civil rights leader. He wanted to change the world in the way that Gandhi had said, be the change you want to be, right?
Yeah.
So like, and Gandhi was a huge influence on his life.
Yeah.
So that is like, to just bring it back to you, absolutely, man. Like I would love to, yes, if you have a sense for why you want to live, man, your title doesn't mean BS, right? It's like you are that person. And now you just need to step into the how of how you do that every single day.
Just taking one step forward, Paul. You know, in your book, you mentioned that when white authority in India or the American South used violence against peaceful protesters, their brutality called into question not only the acts of violence, but also the authority figures' rule of law.
Bingo.
Question unfair rules was the first step Gandhi and the king found to changing them.
Yeah.
Tell me about that. I
So
found
this is
it quite fascinating.
Isn't it though? Like to go into that history of civil disobedience, it's just, oh my God, it's amazing. All right. So I'm going to start this from King's perspective, okay? Because I feel like the reader might appreciate it if we go actually in reverse. King starts, when he gets to seminary school, he wants to understand how he can actually change the world. How can he affect change? And he thinks at first it's going to be just sort of like through this spread of ideas. There was this idea, this theologian in the States named Walter Rauschenbusch. But ultimately, King realizes, no, the world doesn't pivot on the spread of superior ideas. The world spreads on power. Who has it and how do they exert it? And in what few concessions do they have to give in order to obtain more of it? Power decides everything. And that was a philosophy he first understood from an American theologian named Reinhold Niebuhr. And so he became so enamored with Niebuhr. But Niebuhr sort of diagnoses the problem, but he doesn't offer his own solution for what King sees in the American South in the 1950s, which is like, how can we ever have equality? Blacks are still second-class citizens. He turns to Mohandas Gandhi. And what Gandhi did was breathtaking. Gandhi issued a remarkable million-strong disobedience campaign that was completely non-violent. And the more King read about it, the more he realized it did two things. And the ruling British imperialists in the 1930s wrote about it. I found these old documents. It was fascinating research. But they said Gandhi's nonviolence is more dangerous than terrorism. And here's what they mean. If they were to go at Gandhi and his followers and attack them across the head, beat them with their, steel-tipped batons, as they sometimes did, they would be attacked by the British press there in India. They would be attacked by any dignitaries from other countries as, why are you acting like this? This is no way to treat people who are peaceful. They would be attacked by even their own military soldiers. There were numerous accounts of British soldiers who felt nauseous having to try to literally beat back civil nonviolent protesters in India who were following Gandhi, right? However, if they don't beat them back, if they give Gandhi and his followers what they wish, what the British cede is nothing less than their own authority in India.
Precisely.
And when King is reading about this in the 1950s, he's like, India gains its independence without a war. This is remarkable. India gains its independence through love. That's really what it is. Gandhi talked about how we will win them over through love. Now, the question becomes, from whom did he learn this?
Yeah.
That was Leo Tolstoy, the same Leo Tolstoy who wrote War and Peace, the same one who wrote Anna Karenina. Leo Tolstoy was a devout Christian, and toward the end of his life, he wrote this book that was not a novel in any way. It was sort of religious text, and it was called The Kingdom of God Lives Within You. And one of the central tenets of the kingdom of God lives within you is this idea that a true Christian will be peaceful because that is what Christ wanted. Christ wanted us to love one another, right? Respect one another. And if that were the case, there would never be wars because any soldier would say, I refuse to serve. I refuse to harm anybody. So Gandhi was no Christian, but Gandhi found the kingdom of God is within you so riveting when he read it. And in the early 1900s, he started a correspondence with Tolstoy. He from India, Tolstoy in Russia. And he was editing a journal then called Indian Opinion. And he quoted from these letters.
Yeah.
His first ashram was called Tolstoy Farm. That's how much Gandhi was indebted to this idea.
Yeah.
One of the ashrams in South Africa. To change the world. Yeah. So King reads about it so Gandhi does everything he does from like the Salt March to the Sea in 1930s to independence, a decade and a half later. King reads about it in the 1950s. King begins to act on it in the 50s and 60s. It changes America. And it is still to this day, if you think about it, it can still work. All anybody has to do is frankly have the courage to say, the courage and the patience, the courage to say, when I am beaten, I will not fight back. And when I am beaten, I will stand up again. And the patience to say, if I do this for long enough, we will prevail because love is greater than hate.
Yeah. Paul, having said that, and I agree with what you're saying, that love is more powerful than hate. And I'm not surprised because love is considered to be the highest emotion in the order of all the emotions if we put together. Just out of curiosity, what do you think? How do you see the legacy of leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and other influential leaders who have played a very pivotal role in civil right movements or in the freedom fights against different countries, intersecting with the ongoing struggle against the racial injustice that we see today? You just gave the example of Floyd in the year 2020.
Yeah.
Not long back.
No. How does so one way is here in the States, there's a lot of deconstructing of the idea of the great men of history. And I don't think it should be limited to men, but I do think there are great people throughout history who can inspire hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And
in fact,
Gandhi
we cannot limit it to men for sure. The whole civil rights movements got started with Rosa Parks.
Yeah. Right. And King, even in Birmingham, there were women who played a central role to that campaign success. So it was men, it was women. Today, when a lot of people talk about the problems of current society, those problems exist. In some measure, I think they almost always will, because I think Niebuhr was right that power will only yield to a power that can outstrip it. In Gandhi's case, like he and his followers literally became more powerful than the British government, which ruled over it, right? In King's case, he and his followers literally became more powerful than the most hateful, powerful, violent people in the American South. And ultimately they succeeded. And the same can happen today. But again, the world still tilts on power, who has it, and what they can do with it once they have it. And sometimes it's not meant for aims that are all that constructive to our betterment. However, and I believe this fully, the best thing you can do is honestly just like be like Gandhi, right? Like when Gandhi says, if there is a way to be better, you yourself should do it first, right? The best way to change the world is to change yourself, then change the people with whom you encounter, right? And like that's how real change happens. So too often I feel today there are people who lament how these things happen, which let me rephrase. We should all lament that these things are happening. But instead, we should all say, well, what can we do to change it, right? Like the change actually exists within all of us. And we need not go back too far in history to see how other people who were no more powerful than us affected change too, If you read any biographies of Gandhi, you come to understand who he was as a person. He was not a deity. He was just like you and me. He dedicated himself to a cause and said, I'm going to lead my life in this sort of way, and look at the change that he wrought. Anybody can do this, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah. Provided we are willing to embrace the purpose rather than embracing the identity. Right. And that's the reason I think I just loved the title. You have to be prepared to die before you can begin to live. And that dying part has to do with the identity that you've been holding on to.
The ego, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. They say that doesn't really matter who gets the credit for as long as what you want to do gets done.
Yeah, that's true. There's always like, it's not as if, just to bring it back to the civil rights movement in the American South for a minute, even within the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, King's organization, even within that, those guys had huge egos. So like, there was this joke that like, they could all kneel before God, but they could sure stand quite tall before each other. And that's true, man. What I loved about researching this book was they were fully human. They were fully flawed people. And part of it was their own identity. But then how do they find a way, to your point, to put aside that identity and say there is a cause that is greater than our own self-interest? And how can we best act on that cause so that everybody can benefit? And that's when change really starts to happen.
Since we are talking about they were as human as we are, Gandhi was as human as we are. They had their own set of ego, and they were not willing to stand. They were not willing to see each other eye to eye. Just wondering, how can we bring the lessons that you have spoken about in your book in our day-to-day conversations?
That's a great question. One of the best ways to do it is to start with yourself. There's this idea in certain Eastern traditions, through Buddhism, through certain Chinese religious traditions, where to change the world, I must first change my thoughts. And if I change my thoughts, I can perhaps begin to change my behavior. And if I change my behavior, perhaps I can change the way I operate across any one day. And if I change how I operate across any one day, perhaps I can change how I operate across any one week. And if I can change that, perhaps others can begin to notice my actions. And if they start to notice my actions, perhaps they will follow what I am doing. And if they start to follow what I'm doing, perhaps I can do more than just what I am called to do. Perhaps I can actually begin to lead in some way if I feel that I want to, right?
Only if I feel that I want to.
Only if I feel that I want to.
I just love it.
Yeah. You find this through so many different traditions and histories. Like, this is a part of so many Vedic texts, right? This idea that to change your life, you must first change your thoughts. And if you change your thoughts, you can change your behaviors, right? Like, it really does all come back to that. So how do you change your thoughts? Well, what is in your head in a loop? Because there's always something. You talked about the sort of what if questions you had. I've had the same sort of questions, right? First thing to acknowledge is, okay, I'm having these questions. Are they helping me? If not, are they even real? If not, then what is? How can I answer? How can I begin to frame up for a better question?
Yeah.
Change those thoughts and you start to see new behavior.
Paul, a question which is coming to me is that how has you writing that book transformed the context that your children were born into? Because I personally feel that traumas, they travel from one generation to another.
Yeah. Yeah. There is this idea, and my wife states this so beautifully. There is this idea on the one hand, for somebody like Sonia, who was born and raised in the American South, or my mother-in-law, Connie, who was raised in that Jim Crow South, where she was taught separate but equal. There is this idea of generational trauma, which is true, and it extends all the way back to enslavement. That is true. However, Sonia will be the first one to tell you, or especially to tell our kids, you come from a people who have been the most resilient in American history, who have found a way to create, and thrive and live and experience joy every day when they should not have, who have literally built this nation, like all of the things in Washington, D.C., often built by Black people, often built by enslaved Black people, and have also changed the culture in innumerable ways. From every bit of pop culture today is influenced, is infused, is dominated by Black people.
Yeah.
And she tells the kids, that is also your tradition. Never forget that.
So as much as there is generational trauma, but I think what Sanya is feeding is taking pride in the culture that you're coming from, taking pride in the context that you're coming from, and be grateful to the shoulders of those giants on which you are standing on, to your ancestors.
Yeah. And in some sense, what I love about it also is like, it comes back to this idea of like everything is kind of related in the end, because the generational trauma allows for a resilience that is unparalleled in America, right? That resilience is also passed down through the generations, right? That ingenuity surfaces first in, my gosh, like everything from dance to like the blues, rock and roll. Like there's nothing that American culture, as it exists today, is not heavily influenced by, first and foremost, Black culture, right? And so that is a part of your ingenuity just as much as trauma is a part of it. Just as
absolutely,
all of it is related in the end.
Yeah. You know, as I often share, that you just need one person in an entire family. You just need one person in an entire family to let go of the past patterns and the reactive tendencies and give a generative future to the next generation.
Yeah.
And I can so much resonate with you, the kind of work that you have done to be that one person in that entire generation, Paul. I can so much appreciate what Sanya is doing to be that one person in the entire generation, because the next generation would be more generative in nature, would not carry the pain and the burden of the past reactive tendencies.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. You just somewhere along the line, you do just need that one person. And once you, it comes back to what we were saying before, like you can choose to be that one person too, right? You can, you know, I for this book and others, I've read so many different schools of thought and traditions, and my favorite book, and maybe others on your podcast have talked about it before, but Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning is like the great, like, please go buy my book. I want you to, but then after you buy it, if you haven't, please buy Man's Search for Meaning, because it's the greatest book I've ever read. And what he talks about in that book is we cannot change what happens to us. What we can change is how we respond to what happens to us, because in that response lies a choice. And our choice, what it really represents, is our freedom. And even to a certain extent, to use a phrase to echo what you're just saying, it's our freedom and also our transcendence. It's our ability to move above and beyond who we have been so far into something that we want to be, right? Something that we long to be, something that society will benefit from.
Well, just out of curiosity, considering the current landscape of social justice movements, if you look at all around the world, at the same time, there are discrimination happening. There is racism that I get to hear about on different occasions in different parts of the world. What do you think? What steps do you believe are necessary to address this deeply rooted issues of systemic discrimination and create that lasting
so it's
change?
One thing to move from the individual to the systemic. And that can be hard to address. I don't know that it actually is addressed across any one year or series of years by yourself. I think that in the end, what you do need is a committed group of people to do first what Gandhi did, and then what the civil rights movement showed is possible. And I feel like there's ways to do this on the local level. Like there's a ton of activists currently who don't get the sort of publication and press that the people I'm writing about in this book get. But what they're doing on a granular level to say, maybe root out some slumlord, right, who's treating his tenants terribly, right? Or maybe it's like there's so many instances of how this actually happens, but like, that's how you begin. That's how you do it, right? You don't change the system, but what you can do is you sort of chip at it day after day until you begin to have the world that you want.
Yeah. Yeah. One step at a time, one
One step
conversation at a time, one strike at a time. As you mentioned, one chip at a time.
Yeah.
Paul, out of curiosity, having gone through this, all the research that you have done, the different emotions that you would have gone through, and all the different emotions that you would have witnessed by just being a witness to your wife and to your children, and so-called those instances like George, where a part of something personal got damaged for you, right? What do you know for sure with 100% surety and certainty?
I think what I lean on is really, I'm stumbling only because like it's a great question, but it's like it's so multi-layered. But really, if what I were to say, what it comes down to is this sense of when Tolstoy wrote "The Kingdom of God is within you," there have been many people who've interpreted that many different ways, and one of the interpretations is the one I like best. Divinity. It does not need to be Christian. Divinity lives within you, lives within all of us. And if you can find a way to honor that divinity, could be through your professional calling, could be through some sort of personal one, could be through a familial one. What you're doing is honoring God, and define God however you want. Honoring the divine. That is actually one of the highest things you can do in life, right? Because you're honoring yourself, and you're honoring the thing that enables life. Like, so yeah, the honor that divinity. And I feel like that is how we lead a good life. And by leading good lives, and I think that's kind of how we also begin to change the world so it's better the way that we want it.
Yeah. Yeah. Paul, thank you so much.
I've loved this. This has been great.
I can go on for hours and hours together.
I would love to do it again. Like it can be for the book or anything else, man. But just like, if you ever want to have me on again, just holler, okay?
Would be an absolute pleasure. I think thoroughly enjoyed my conversation with you, and I could resonate with every single sentence that you spoke about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good one.